Good morning, everyone. I just want to say first how impressed I am I've been covering social affairs for, 25 years probably. I remember interviewing Pat Bennett actually in Earlsford Terrace. Hello there, Pat. But I find that video really moving, actually. The work that the Family Resource Centres do is just absolutely crucial. And I suppose any supermarket chain would be impressed with the demand that is obviously there that they've grown from 10 to 121 in 25 years. So I don't know what that says about our society, but there's definitely a need and an increasing need, obviously, for the work of the Family Resource Centres. So I'm going to start. You've all been introduced, I suppose, but we'll go. Kate Duggan, again, is interim CEO of TUSLA. Liz Canavan is with the Department of the Taoiseach and is involved in the new Child Poverty Unit, obviously very crucial work and close to the hearts of, I'd say, everyone in this room. And Deirdre Duffy is with the Community Foundation of Ireland and obviously is very important as well to everyone in this room in terms of philanthropic funding for the Family Resource Centres. So I suppose I'll put a question out to the whole panel first, and obviously Fergal, you all know who Fergal is. As I said, the video that we've seen there shows the crucial work that's being done, and that has been done over the last 25 years, and the need is still there, and the need is probably growing, with the cost of living crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, the COVID crisis, the climate crisis is all having an impact, particularly and most of all on marginalised communities. Where would you see the work of the Family Resource Centres over the next, say, 25 years, the future, and where does that fit in with, from your perspective, say, first, Kate, in TUSLA?
Yeah, thanks, Kitty. I think certainly, and I've referred to it, I think the need is there, but the need is growing and the need is changing. And I think what we have seen over the last number of years is just the agility and the way Family Resource Centres, because they are at the heart of communities, have been able to change in order to meet that need. And certainly, into the future, we're going to need a continuum of services. I think it's very much the future as being about developing and delivering services that respond to local population needs, because those needs are different. I mean, Family Resource Centres have a footprint across the length and breadth of Ireland, and we do know that the needs are different in different places. So I think it's working with all of the agencies in regions to develop that continuum of services, and that Family Resource Centres obviously have a clear role in that provision.
Okay, and Liz, from your perspective in the Department of the Taoiseach?
Yeah, I mean, I guess really not too different from what Kate's saying there. I mean, what always strikes me is the very holistic approach that Family Resource Centres have. And I suppose in a way, when people say, well, what do Family Resource Centres do or provide? Like, the answer is what's needed. And I guess when I was very involved obviously in COVID and still very involved in Ukraine from the central government point of view. And like, often you're thinking about the big picture stuff and the big things that need to happen, the big policy changes. But often when you're thinking about, as we called it in COVID, the final mile, like that really local piece, that's where you need this kind of really tailored response. And that it's not uniquely FRC's, but FRCs certainly are part of that fabric, which allows us to reach in right at the very, very closest to where families are at and actually be able to respond in a very agile way. And they've done that in my experience, both in the context of COVID and Ukraine. And it's that kind of agility which is really important. And I suppose one of the things that I would reflect on, having worked in both the Department of Health, the Department of Children, now in Taoiseach's, is when you look back at what has been developed over the last 20, 30, 40 years in Ireland in terms of social services. We've built a lot of infrastructure and service provision, both statutory and non-statutory, but where the real complexity is now and where the real added bit now is in this space. And that's where we'll never dream this up sitting in government buildings. We actually need to feel what that feels like on the ground and how you manage. Like, people don't come to us in boxes of mental health or a bit of help with family support. They come with lots and lots of stuff. And we have to be much more innovative, I suppose, in terms of how we respond to that. They don't care who employs anyone. They don't really care how anyone's funded. Sorry, guys. They just want to know, can they get the help they need? And I think FRCs are part of a group of networks that help us make that happen.
Okay. Deirdre, from a CFI point of view?
Yeah, and I might just pick up on Liz's point there. So first of all, congratulations everyone for making it this far. We're about 3 years behind you. So we were founded in 2000. We're a philanthropic hub, as people will know, and we're delighted to support many of the organisations in this room. And I hope you'll be with us for our 25th anniversary. So we have a bit of a twin track approach, I suppose, in terms of our life cycle. But Liz's point there around people not coming in boxes, and to Kate's point earlier about belonging, I think they're really the nub of this. And that's the ambition that we share with everyone in this room. And even looking at the video, I mean, it's you just want everyone in the country to see it. And I was delighted to see the toy show in there. And when I was looking back through, our relationship over the past 20 years, when you see, Kitty, the type of funding that the Community Foundation has been delighted to channel into the resource centres, it's from everything, from like mental health to well-being to creativity to play to cooking. Like, it's the whole gamut of the human experience. And I think what we share in common is the connection. So that grassroots connection, it's been discussed quite considerably around the cost of living crisis, the Ukraine and COVID. And I think it's worth acknowledging throughout the day. But also then, Kitty, like the empowerment of local people, of individuals and communities, community leaders, organisations, because people know the solutions to their own challenges. And I think that's a real magic that this network brings to the big societal issues that we're facing. And that's, I suppose, the ambition that we share with you in philanthropy. And then I might just mention as well, Kitty, because you talked about the climate change and biodiversity crisis. Again, the other big issue of our time, huge in its complexity, can feel very overwhelming, but it's, there's nothing more pressing in the human race. And I think that when we look at systems, action plans, budgets, all those big transformational things that we need in the state to solve this, they're huge, but they can feel very distant. But the impact is not distant. The impact is on us. It's pollution, it's flooding, it's rising sea levels. And I was really happy to see climate justice, Virgil, in your plan and climate change, because I think that's where we're going to have to really channel our focus around combating disadvantage and inequality, protecting people from what's coming, and adopting that climate justice approach. And certainly in the foundation, that's our plan as well. Again, we're in sync in terms of where we're going over the next while.
Virgil, from your obviously key vantage point, the future of the FRCs and how the past, the work so far, how it can be built on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very exciting time for FRCs and for the FRC national programme and for the forum and its role in representing FRCs. It's great really to welcome the attention to localism, and I see it very positively and constructively. It's funny because over the last 20 years, I mean, at one point around the time of the change from the health boards to the HSE, it was almost like a drive to centralisation. And these things happen over the years. You go through different cycles. I think at that time there was probably a sense that centralisation delivers accountability, but that was probably a bit of a misdiagnosis in some ways, and it wasn't the solution to the problems that were being identified at that time. So, and I think, an unintended consequence of how we do government in this country, where we don't have strong local government like other countries, is that we have a lot of national bodies and state agencies and government departments, and money comes down through a series of channels, we'll say. That could be silos, they don't have to be silos, but they're generally for a particular population cohort or a particular issue or problem. Whereas we all know that families and communities don't live in those silos or those boxes, as Liz said. Families and communities live in a completely integrated way, from conception through to infancy, throughout the life course to old age. And older people play a vital role in a healthy community around relationships between people, around supporting younger families and so on and so forth. Not just their own family, it's actually much more fluid than that. in terms of the contribution that people make. So for me, I think the next 25 years is about, committing to that localism as we go into the different types of restructurings, not just what TUSLA are doing in forms of restructuring, which is very much aligned to our approach to local decision making. But as Liz says, across government, there's different changes happening. So to me, it's about how we navigate our space within that as family resource centres, and how we welcome collaboration, and how we are not the total solution at all. We're not in every community, and even the communities we're in, it's all about collaboration with other agencies that TUSLA fund, with other agencies that other government departments fund. So it's about doing that collaboration in a way that maintains the integrity of our model. So yes, it's engaging and being in that space, but it's been very clear and assertive and confident and unapologetic for the way that we work, which isn't issue-based or age cohort-based or anything like that. It's very much community development across the life course.
I might come back to you, Liz, on that, because, you said yourself that, when the department brings out policies, you don't know how it's going to feel locally. You rely on the local bodies to really feed back that. And one of the strategic goals is about impact and influencing policy. How would you advise your local FRC and the national body to bring that local knowledge and sense of what's happening and the influence of policies back to the big high-level departments and influence policy?
I suppose starting with the Department of Children, I think my experience, certainly, I think the sector for children and families is one of the most collaborative and works very well with both TUSLA and the Department of Children, the centre there. And I think those relationships have been formed, really since the first children's strategy, because there was always that sense that we had to understand children's lives and we weren't going to understand it sitting in a government department. So I think that's my experience certainly is, I think that's quite unique. And just to pick up on what Fergal's saying, that collaboration, keeping that collaboration going. And what I was struck by in the work I did and still do with the children's sector and the broader family sector and all of the people working in areas of social disadvantages, the best magic comes when people actually are genuinely problem solving together. And I think we are doing more and more of that, and I think we do it most in this kind of world, because I think often you find there's advocacy which is saying just do this, and government says, Jews, we can't do that. Whereas I think in this sector there's much more a sense of saying, well, look, we can't do everything, so what do we do first? And I think we've seen that in the child and family area, and it's certainly my philosophy, because we know that we don't fully understand the front level. I certainly know that. And I think we understand more and more we need that input. But I think already, the network here is good at that collaboration. I mean, we obviously reached out to Fergal when we were thinking about the Child Poverty Unit. We also have a really close relationship with the Children's Rights Alliance, which again, the FRC is a member of. And there are also the structures that the Department of Children. But I am struck by the fact that they're not your only audience, that there's a wider life course piece to that. But I think, our understanding, as I said earlier, even of the child poverty, is that it involves everybody, involves the community. It's not just that child and that particular family. So it is quite an expansive concept of that. So I do think there's lots of structures. I think already you use them well. And what I would say at local level, what we really need to work really hard on is collaborating locally and problem solving locally. And then, not that the FRC network is saying this, that actually people working together locally, statutory and voluntary, well, actually this is the thing. Whether we're doing it, they're doing it, or somebody else is doing it, this is the thing. And where we see really strong consortium around projects like, say, the ABC programme, is where those actors came together and said, let's leave all our hats to one side. What is the thing or the few things we really need to do together? And when you can just, everybody break down those barriers, you really begin to sift through what's the most important thing and how can we do it together. And I think FRCs are really well placed philosophically to do that, and I think they do it. So hold on to that, I think, is important, but always see everybody else as key in terms of that collaboration, because you won't do it on your own. So,
And can the FRCs feed into policy beyond, say, your unit in the department, say things that are impacting on their work, like the housing crisis and like the Ukraine crisis, or things that people might say is a little bit outside their bailiwick in terms of homelessness?
And they already do, to be fair. So just to be clear, I don't just have child poverty. That would be nice. Wouldn't that be nice, Anna? So I have all of health, all of social policy. So we're dealing with Ukraine. We've dealt with COVID, obviously. We're dealing with, a particular project around social disadvantage. Obviously, we're very involved in that specific project in the Northeast Inner City. And we're trying to look much more broadly at how do we begin to knit together what needs to happen at local level. So, Fergal talked earlier about, this idea of centralisation. I was quite involved in the setup of the HSE, and just to be clear, it was never intended to be centralisation. It was intended to be bringing a consistency to the centre and the governance. The actual intention was to delegate locally. It just never quite happened that way. So I think that's where we need that drive now, and I think that every department is. And you're dealing with lots of different departments. So, I was I met the Ukraine Civil Society Forum, and there was FRCs in the room. And certainly my conversation is, how can all of these people who are already doing some of this work, how can we harness that? And how can they inform what needs to happen and what the demand is locally? So I think FRCs are in those spaces already, and certainly, we're open to that. And we can see through just flicking through the annual report there, the number of areas, the number of large agencies who need this kind of reach. So I think it's just to continue those kind of alliances is really important, and I think they do have that voice.
Kate, coming to you and the work of TUSLA, how would you see the FRCs working best with TUSLA over the next, you're saying there's a reform programme in TUSLA, there's a lot of change there, and how would the FRCs feed into that?
I think just going back on two things which is linked to it that Liz and certainly Fergal have referenced. I think we certainly as an agency see the value in the strength of the National Forum, and certainly we have committed funding to help that kind of national approach to FRCs in terms of, because they're not a homogenous group. We see variation across the 121 family resource centres, and so certainly there's the value in bringing consistency and looking at the kind of the quality of the services that are being delivered and the types of services, and bringing standards in around that. But it still goes back to the local engagement, and our experience again is that there's variation in the depth and the strength of that engagement at local and regional level, and that's something we're very committed to improving in terms of strengthening the participation and the voice of all of our community and voluntary partners in supporting us to make decisions about how we, kind of fund and structure and deliver services. But certainly, we talk again about the changing demand in terms of the needs of individuals and of children and of families and of communities. And certainly our ambition is around delivering local integrated service that meet the needs of children and families living in communities. And we see FRCs as a huge part of that in the areas that they are, but also in other areas. But I think it's also important, and it keeps coming back to, we talk about wanting integrated services, we talk about not delivering services in silos, but there's a challenge in that for all of us to, somehow leave our hats at the door when we come into a room, and to work collectively with all of the agencies, statutory, community and voluntary, within a region or within an area, to put the children and the families and the communities at the centre, and to stand back and think, what is needed? Where is the skill and the strength that we have as an individual agency to deliver that? And how do we best do it collectively? Yeah. And I think that's a really big challenge for all of us that we have to take forward into the future if to really make a difference.
And is there work being done on how to do that? Or is it feel it as you go?
No, not at all. I mean, I think, I've said we engage all of the time. I think in terms of even the National Forum and us supporting and strengthening that has been around ensuring that there is that level of influence in terms of, kind of communication, hearing the views from the family resource centres across the country, from their staff, from their volunteers, from their community representatives. I think certainly as we're embarking on our reform programme, as other agencies are changing, as the Family Resource Centre are developing their strategic plan, it's around putting in place, maybe more formally and more consistently, the structures around that engagement and planning.
Okay. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe just to come in there. I mean, one of the things we are looking at in the department is what are the ways in which, we really can tackle and intensify the supports that some communities need at a particular point in time. And what we keep coming back to is it's not necessarily we need loads of new services. We need to be able to find where the gaps are and fill those smaller gaps. But actually the real magic is in the greater than the sum of the parts. If we could get all of the services, whether they're statutory or voluntary, singing together, I think that's where the magic potential is. But the challenge, and that's been referred to, is everyone has their, particularly statutory, they've very specific statutory functions that they have to deliver on. So the challenge is then trying to find the space to do that crossover and find the platform within which you can do that. But we do have examples of it, we just haven't done it at scale. And that's where, in my mind anyway, we have a single platform that everyone can jump onto and say, right, I can do this bit, but I can't do that bit. Or I can do this bit, but maybe I'd be better off doing less of that and letting those people do that. And actually having a comfort around that, because there's a trusted platform within which, at a very local level, you can say what's needed now, because communities change and the challenges change. But people need a confidence that if they move out of a space, somebody else will move in, or if they're handing over a family or a child, that there's a confidence they'll be picked up. And they're the things that people come back most about is those gaps, that lack of confidence. You're holding a family that you can't help as much as you need to, but you don't know where to send them to next, and there are gaps there. So that's something we want to look at as to how we could help, not necessarily go and say, here's the prescription for every single county and every single local area. That won't work. It has to be more organic than that, but we need a platform within which that can work.
Yeah, I know there's a concept of no wrong door.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Deirdre, coming to you and funding, the crucial issue, and it strikes me again watching that video that an awful lot of the work should be fully funded by the state. It's crucial, essential work, and it's kind of awful that people are having to go out and fundraise to provide essential services. But obviously, philanthropic funding is a key part of keeping the family resources hedge. What's your perspective on how to maximise accessing philanthropic funding and what the family resource centres need to kind of demonstrate to access that?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, everyone in this room is a really valued partner, and I would say our door is always open. You have been key to our strategic impact for the last 20 years, and I hope you'll continue to be so. I would say in terms of the state, Kitty, there's been a lot of public discourse recently about the size of the state and the state needing to be bigger, and I think that's probably right. I think we've talked about the changing needs and the complexity. I think the state has been firefighting, and I also, I think it's important to thank people like Liz that have done really great work over the last number of years, because they don't often get thanked. But the reality is that there are gaps in the state structures as well, if I can put that cat among the pigeons. So that's where philanthropy and where our donors and our community of donors come in. We, I suppose, connect into about 5,000 different grantees across the country. We have hundreds of donors that work with us. And what we want to do is to connect people with private money who have a strategic intent around a common purpose and a common good into where it's needed into communities. And while we're in this spot of a state that is in a state of change, trying to respond to huge crises, in firefighting mode in some respects, I think philanthropy plays a really key role here. And sometimes I like to kind of think of philanthropy as the water among rocks. So if you think of state structures, they need to be solid, They need to be very structured. It's the basis of our democracy. The charity sector is extremely well regulated, as people know. But what philanthropy enables us to do is that water to move between the rocks. So we're interested in innovation. We're interested in the type of things that Liz is talking about, with collaborations at community level where people are driving forward solutions that have never been heard of before. Young people, old people, people with disabilities working together around universal themes. That's what our donors respond to. That is what motivates them. And there isn't a project in this room that we can't advocate for in terms of our community of donors. So I would say, by and large, our door is open. 2 points I just wanted to make, Kitty. I suppose there's different strengths and skills in any team, in any group, in any community, and we would see philanthropy working hand in hand with the state, with you guys, in terms of achieving the greater good. At the moment, we've been waiting quite a while for a national policy on philanthropy. And we think that this is key because philanthropy is very underdeveloped in Ireland. We're lagging behind other countries. But for you guys, it's key in 2 respects. What we'd love to see in that policy, and nothing is agreed yet, is match funding across government, again, in that kind of collaborative, holistic way. So we do secure match funding, private and public funding together. But can you imagine if we had a policy that said every state agency, every government department can engage with the community and voluntary sector in a way that maximises the resources in this country, because we're all in it together. And the second thing is the place-based giving. And I see in your annual report, you had your event in Athlone in 22 around place-based giving. Our donors really motivated by that, as are we. So the notion, again, that a village, a town, a city comes together with private investment, state investment, looks to the solutions, builds up their leaders, and shares that good practice, best practice more broadly, is something that I think will be key to a lot of the big social issues that we're talking about, because it recognises the local collaboration and continuum, but also the variation, the points that were raised here as well.
Okay, there's some questions coming in. I don't know, Virgil, do you want to come back on anything that's been said?
Just maybe to pick up, I think it's really important that the National Forum doesn't unintentionally become a centralised monster like what can happen sometimes in the design of organisations. So, we need to be clear, we need to do our work internally, and TUSLA has supported us with funding to be able to do that. So under the forthcoming strategic plan, we really need to, I suppose, characterise the model, to use the language, but really describe what it is that we think is the kind of the secret that is an FRC as distinct from another way of working. So whilst, and it's kind of the rocks of the state service and of the big voluntary charitable providers that work alongside them, and the water that is the philanthropy, we're neither the water nor the rocks. We're somewhere there in between, and we're wanting to work collaboratively with the philanthropy, and we're wanting to work collaboratively with the state agencies and with the other voluntary bodies. But there is something there that we need to work on. I think the President's speech will be helpful to us in terms of the language, right? So, even a service, I would say that an FRC is a centre, not a service, that we provide support more so than interventions. So there's a very appropriate language, professional language that comes with the technical delivery of services, and we facilitate the delivery of many services, but we don't really identify as a service per se. A bit like how youth work would describe itself in terms of being a developmental process with individual and groups rather than an intervention.
Okay, there's quite a few questions coming in, so I better put some of them to you. And this might be for Fergal. Some of the most rurally deprived areas in Ireland are not covered by the FRC programme. I'm thinking of Donegal, actually, when I saw that. It said,
what made you think that's for me? Is that not for Liz? No?
Inishowen and the Gaeltacht areas, which I know are, some terrible poverty. I actually just got an email from someone 2 days ago asking me to come up and look at the issues of food poverty in the Gaeltacht areas of Donegal. So are there plans to expand further? What are, in terms of 121, where will we be in 10, 25 years, do you think?
I think it's interesting that the National Forum are contacted on a regular basis by local community groups wanting to form an FRC. I think we can see from the parliamentary questions going to Roger Gorman that he's regularly and maybe it's the lead up to the next general election, he's been regularly questioned from TDs and senators in relation to new FRCs. Within the National Forum, we're very conscious that as we come up to 25 years, there are some family resource centres who have been part of the programme, some maybe throughout that 25 years or came in during that 25 years, who receive less funding than any new FRC might be given. So we have a very clear position that we've articulated to the department, and we are articulating this evening in Buswells to all the elected representatives that we would like all FRCs brought up to a minimum level of funding. And we want to be able to do that in partnership with TUSLA before any new FRCs are added. So, you know, there's obviously something good about the model if people are specifically asking for an FRC. So they're not asking for, you know, a generic service, they're asking for a family resource centre. But that's a matter for government, really. The expansion of the programme and the addition of new FRCs is a matter for government. It's not a matter that we decide.
Okay.
But we would feel that before that happens, the existing FRCs need to be adequately funded first. And any new FRCs, as we begin to characterise the model as I described and really explain the fusion of community development with service delivery, but community development first, that new FRCs, if they are added in the future by government through TUSLA, for example, that model, the integrity of that model and the fidelity to that model of community development is a key aspect of what we would like any new FRCs in the future to have.
So I suppose I better put that question to Liz and Kate. Is the funding model being looked at, and is there scope for more FRCs?
Will I go first? Okay. So first, just to say, I don't work at the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, so I don't have to make those choices. So two things probably worth saying. One of the things that strikes me, and I've thought this anyway, but it's really been driven home to me today, looking at the video, is part of the strength of the FRC is that you don't fit into one particular box, and part of the risk of having a core funder like TUSLA is that it makes it feel like you do, and you don't actually. So on the other hand, is it fair to be saying you need to be running around trying to, you know, seek grants everywhere? This is one of the challenges we see, where we're driving a kind of a need to generate all these applications for various types of funding programs. So we're trying to figure out how do you balance that off. But then, of course, departments get voted expenditure based on their ministers' scope of activity. So it's really quite challenging, and it's hard to pool money. But it does strike me that one of the strengths of the FRCs and a network is it begins to bring that together and begins to articulate that a bit better. But it does make it a challenge in terms of how to then go to seeking funding. I suppose one of the things that I would say, and hopefully my colleagues won't be saying what she said up there, but is to try to build out the business case for what the FRC, not uniquely, but the FRC are offering. So it's part of how we talk about social fabric, but actually, you know, part of what the FRCs are doing is sort of weaving that social fabric a little bit where there are gaps in it and where society's changed and life's changed so much. But we need to find ways then of, you know, trying to not involve FRCs in too much activity and filling in forms and actually get them doing the work. So part of what we're doing in this programme, I mentioned that social disadvantage, is bringing together all the players who are probably funding FRCs, or, you know, we've other examples on the youth side as well, where people are getting funded from Justice, they're getting funded from Decity, they're getting funded from TUSLA, they're getting funded from community maybe. So how do we make that more orderly and easier to do? So that's not answering your question, but where does the funding come from? But I can see the strength is also part of the challenge in trying to attract a very, a totally integrated funding model for the FRCs and the network. Okay. And now I leave Kate with the really hard question.
No, and I think everything that has been said is correct. I think the challenge for all of us is there's you know, the needs are so great.
Yeah.
The needs are changing, the needs are complex, and there's gaps in lots of places. And so again, I keep going back to this sense, there may be an area where we don't have an FRC, but actually we have a really strong statutory or community and voluntary sector. So I think it's certainly around looking today in Ireland, across that map and mapping, yes, the FRCs, and there certainly will be a need for an expansion of more kind of family resource centres or family support services, but it's looking to see where the most urgent need is and what is the best service
there
to be able to deliver that need in the context of what's already there.
Okay. Deirdre, you were...
Yeah, just very briefly, I have another small cat in my bag, but I just wanted to mention to people there is a kind of a global movement that is also under discussion in Ireland around the value of community organising. And that's, we all know community organising, but this is more from a funding approach. And it's kind of based on trust-based philanthropy and back to the let's say, the given that communities know how to organise themselves and they know and can identify solutions to the challenges they're facing. So we're certainly working with partners in different trusts and foundations to develop this a bit further. And again, it goes back to, what role does everyone play in the orchestra? And potentially what we have in the nonprofit sector is the ability to fund more free-flowing community organising that, let's say, a state structure wouldn't have. And I think that's really important as well, just in terms of what you were saying there, because a state will have an obligation to protect people who have the most need and who are in dire need. And, I think that's the right way to go, but there might be more fluidity in the non-profit sector and how we can fund and organise people.
There's a question in from Portlaoise FRC, and I suppose, as we have 10, 12 more minutes left, it's this kind of a question that would lead to us towards the end. For everyone, what is the key strategic advice you would give to the FRCs for continued development into the next 25 years? But I suppose from a TUSLA point of view, what would be the key?
I think if any of us were to be asked in 1988 what would be the key strategic advice we'd give FRCs for the next 25 years, we could never imagine, I suppose, where we're at in terms of, on one hand, the growth, but on the other hand, just the complexity of the challenges. So I'm certainly not going to give any advice to any organisation for 25 years, but I think what we've seen today in terms of the strategic plan that is being developed, for the FRCs clearly articulates, I think, across the key pillars what they hope to achieve in the next, kind of 3 to 5 years. And I think really that has to be the ambition that any of us have in terms of looking to kind of 3 or 5 years and to plan for that. But the most important bit, and I think it's what the FRCs have shown, huge strength in, is just that agility. And I think that's what we've seen, over the last 3 years, that need to be agile, that need to be able to listen to the communities in which you serve and to be able to respond. And we can all have a great plan and we can all plan to do. And all of a sudden there's something that comes at us from an external perspective that changes a need or changes an urgency or a prioritisation. So I think the plan is there, and I think it's how we, shift the agility in how we implement that plan. And I think the other thing is to strategically contribute to those conversations around the interagency piece from a point of view of advocacy, influence, funding and delivery, because I think Liz's point, we are better when we work as the sum of our parts rather than as an individual organisation or entity.
Yeah. I mean, it really strikes me that the FRCs are probably the best model we have in terms of having both the agility, the expertise, the community involvement, and feeding that up, that has channels that are there to feed that up to government, the experience. It strikes me they should be backed all the way to do as much work as they can possibly do. I think they really are the best model out there. What you say, Liz, what you...
Yeah, I mean, there are other actors with similar philosophies, some in some of the same spaces, or some in very related spaces. So I think we should be conscious of that. It's a real patchwork, which is a challenge, but a strength, I think. We have to figure out how to better organise it. That's my own view. In terms of strategic advice, I suppose, just to Kate's point, the next 25 years, like, change is just getting faster.
Yeah.
So, like, the next 25 years is almost, I'm sure, unimaginable to most people in the room.
Absolutely.
The next 10 years or the next 5 years will probably move as quickly as the last 20. And that's our experience, you know. So I suppose that's the first thing to say. The second thing, maybe to pick up on a point Fergal has made, it's great that the forum, you know, is stronger and has stronger support to bring some of that sort of strategic view. So I think the challenge will be, and we'll be pushing demands on both sides of this, you know, probably both Kate and other actors on the statutory side. So how, on the one hand, do you bring a bit more kind of consistency to the offer in order to better, you know, make sure it's better understood what the offer is, and at the same time, you know, preserve that agility and that, well, we're getting into the space where we're needed. We're not in that space. We're not needed in that space. So, like, I remember, you know, when Fergal and Louise came in, I was saying, give me a flavour, you know, and, you know, there's a huge diversity. And even, you know, Fergal's comment about the centre vis-a-vis the service. But I mean, there are lots of services being provided by some FRCs and not by others. So I suppose in terms of trying to figure out where you fit and in terms of trying to communicate what the FRC is about, there's something about trying to get more of a sort of not a standardisation, but just a more consistency of message around what it's offering, what it's trying to offer. And as I say, it's trying to strike the right balance then and not going so far in that direction that you start standardising everything and suddenly you lose that agility.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other byword is absolutely collaboration. This only works, you know, if it's collaborating with both statutory and other actors on the ground. That again is the most important thing, and that's where the hardest job is yet to be done, in my view, in terms of community services in Ireland.
Okay. Do you think there's a sufficient awareness of family resource centres in all communities? Is that what you're saying in terms of, like?
It's a bit of that, but I suppose maybe not fully understanding what they do, you know, what they offer. Okay. So, like, in some places, and you can see from the videos, you know, there's quite a different emphasis, or people chose to emphasise different things. To be fair, I'm sure the videos didn't capture everything. But there was one service which, you know, obviously he's, you know, said they're running 3 childcare services. Yeah. Like, that's very different than what maybe some other services are doing. There's nothing wrong with that, because again, that's obviously where the need is. Yeah. And we would see that as very positive. But I guess then for an individual community, they understand what the FRC is. But as you go up to departments or to government, they're saying, well, what exactly do they do? Are these childcare providers? Yeah. Well, no, they're not. They do provide childcare. Okay. So it's trying to, I suppose, find a way of articulating in a very tangible way, not just a philosophy, but a very tangible way, what the potential of what an FRC can offer an individual community. Okay. And I think maybe that isn't as well understood.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Deirdre?
Yeah, very briefly, I suppose. The main advice would be to plan for the unexpected, as you do already. And just to acknowledge, I suppose, the role of the FRCs and Fergal and his team in relation to the rise of anti-democracy extremists in Ireland, and how that frontline community response has been ready to go in a very positive and action-orientated way, and that doesn't respond on another playing field, but responds in relation to inclusion, integration, family supports. And I think it's remarkable, the nationwide response, and the FRCs have been at the forefront of that. So I just wanted to say that. But that is an example of the unexpected. We just didn't expect it right now. I suppose it was always coming, but you were ready and ready to go. And then if I think about our donors, and we have a mix of people who come to us who would like to invest strategically. But our typical donor, for example, would be a family who potentially built up a business, came into unexpected wealth, and they would like to give back, and they'd like to do something for the good. And what they're looking for, and I think what you do, is strategic, enduring, impactful change. So breaking the cycles of disadvantage. So understanding that if you support and educate and socialise and bring joy into the life of a mother, that you're giving that to an entire family. All the stuff that you know more than I do. And that's what motivates the people that come to the Community Foundation. So I suppose it's to keep doing what you're doing, and maybe to just leave that message that it's that interventionist, and not in the way that you were saying, Fergal, but breaking a cycle, intervening to change something that maybe seems intractable, because we all know that things are changing very quickly. So what I would say is, well, why can't inequality change very quickly now as well? And that's the type of message that I would be giving to our donors in relation to the FRCs.
Okay.
Okay, Fergal, I'll come to you finally. We heard a lot there from the panellists, a lot of insight into the strategic future and strategic planning for the FRCs. Would you give us your final thoughts?
I suppose, I mean, what I wrote here is what I'd like to see for FRCs for the next 25 years is to engage collaboratively with confidence in the integrity of our model. So there's homework for us in that to kind of tangibly, as Liz said, describe the difference between a community development approach and a service provision to individuals approach. And both are really important parts of the system. And I don't, when you asked about the best model, it's like we want to have a best practice model, but we don't want to be the best model in the sense of a competitive sense. And there's always that risk maybe it's probably in every country, but I think in our context, there's a risk of sort of cannibalizing ourselves within the sector because in the fight for resources. And we've even seen that sometimes that can occur within our own program if we don't arrange ourselves regionally and nationally and collaboratively to say that we are a network. We're not going to compete with each other. We're going to collaborate with each other. But that's the same then. Many of our members sit, and I sit on behalf of the National Forum on fora with the Prevention and Early Intervention Network, with the Children's Rights Alliance, and probably more specifically to that challenge around resourcing and adequate sustainable resources, I sit on networks with the Wheel. And that's been really collaborative and really helpful for me, because I suppose I do have a point to make on behalf of FRCs through the National Forum, but actually I'm not going to be making that in competition with the rest of the community and voluntary sector, because there is an issue with adequate sustainable funding and indeed, adequate sustainable funding in order to pay adequate terms and conditions to attract good people, which is actually essential for the delivery of quality programs, supports, activities and services. So all that collaboration is absolutely essential to me. And I think really my takeaway is how do we bring a degree of consistency to and we're going to see this maybe a bit more this afternoon in the panel discussion where you see family resource centres in action. But the consistency is in our standard around and our methodology in relation to community development primarily, rather than a standardising of what FRCs do. So I fundamentally, in order to resist that kind of notion of centralisation, fundamentally respect the autonomy, and it links very much with what Deirdre was saying about that trust-based philanthropy. And there's I'm sure Pat is kind of laughing because the Family Support Agency's method was to invite a community to do a community needs analysis, submit a strategic plan on a 3-year cycle, and go away and implement it. It was a very different model to what we've gone into today. Basically, it was saying to the community, you know what your needs are, you know them best. Okay, you got to run them by us, and they had I'm sure they had a methodology. I put the last application into Pat in sometime in the mid-noughties for a new FRC in Littleton, which we haven't got yet, but we'll get there eventually. But there was a methodology to it, but there was a huge degree of trust by the state at that time. And I'm sure, Dermot could say a bit about that as well, that actually the community knows what it needs. And that's not, there's a whole other host of services, that are coming with pre-prepared solutions. And they're very important too. I'm not disrespecting those. I come from a child protection social work background, but I chose to move away from that, and not out of disrespect for that. Most of my friends and network are still in that, but when you're working with the second or third generation, of a family, there is something in you that's saying, this is really important work and it has to be done in the moment, but there's something not working with the individual intervention to each generation. So when Liz, we had an internal discussion in the context of the far right, and what do we do about it? And it was very much, amongst our members, we need to go back to first principles around community development, social inclusion, non-discrimination. But if we can't have those conversations collectively at regional and national level, we can't be coherent about how we do that with our partners at local level. And I'm sure Ballymun Family Resource Centre are here today, so they were able to come to national conversation with fellow FRCs and the Hope and Courage Collective to talk about the methodologies of opposing the far right. And then they were able to go back into their local network. And this has happened, I think, in Kerry as well in relation to the far right hate speech kind of situation. So FRCs will always be principally pointed to the local within their own community. And Kate would have seen it in Boyle last week. It's primarily Boyle for Boyle FRC, and then it's Roscommon, and it's hugely place-based. But we could just have Boyle FRC and let them at it, but I think Louise would say Boyle FRC is a member of the West Regional Network and as a member of the National Forum, and the leadership then of the likes of Louise or whoever it is becoming chair of the National Forum, and now we have, you'll see in the afternoon, we're meeting with Andrew Russell from our equivalent network in the US. We're now developing international networks as well. So it's like hyper-local, but international as well. I'm unapologetic for it, I suppose. That's our model, that's our approach. And I think we can engage in collaboration best when we feel confident and assured of the value of our approach.
Okay, that's a great note to end on. I'd like to thank all our panel, Kate, Liz, Deirdre and Fergal, and give them all a round of applause. Thanks. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. There are some more, but I've been assured they'll be followed up by the network.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks very much. Thank you. Go on down now.